JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation, is a concise, structured data format. It's used in Android to move data around the web from server to device, but can also be used to save structured data locally to persistent storage. I'll show you how to use JSON in the Android SDK in this project, JSON Data Files. The user interface for this version of the project has a very minimal set of controls: 2 buttons for creating and reading a file, and 1 text view object to display text. I'll go to my main activity class and scroll down toward the bottom of the code and find the method createFile. In this version of my createFile method, I already have code to create a file in internal storage, that is, a file that's local to the current application. But I'll add code here to create a JSON data packet. I'll place the cursor above any of the other code in the method, and I'll start by creating an instance of the class JSONArray. It's spelled JSON in all uppercase, and then array. And I'll name the object data. A JSON array is a resizable array. You can add as many objects as you want to it, and then it will automatically serialize the data into a JSON notation string. I'll instantiate the object with the class's constructor method using new JSONArray. Next, I'll declare an instance of a class called JSONObject, and I'll name that tour. I'm not instantiating it quite yet. I'm just going to start with declaring it. A JSON object is a dynamic object that implements the Java map interface. You can add values to the JSON object as key value pairs. The keys are always strings, but then the values can be anything you want. I'll create a single tour instance. I'll instantiate the object using tour equals new JSON object. And then I'll add a couple of properties. I'll name my 2 properties tour and price. The tour will be a string, that'll be the name of the tour, and the price will be a numeric value. Because I'll be working in JavaScript style, the data types will be dynamically inferred from my syntax. First, I'll create the tour name. I'll call tour.put, and I'll pass in a string of tour and a value of salt and sea. Because the string salt and sea is surrounded in quotes, its data type will be a string. Notice that I'm getting a warning icon. This is telling me I need to add a throws declaration. Whenever you start creating JSON objects or JSON arrays, you might throw an exception called JSON exception. I'll add that to the throws clause by clicking on the icon and doing a quick fix. That adds JSON exception to the list of exceptions that might be thrown from this method. I'll come back to my call to the put method, and I'll duplicate that. Then I'll change the key for the second value from tour to price. And I'll change the value from a string to a number. This is a pure numeric literal, and it'll be translated as a numeric data type by the JavaScript notation code. This will be a simple version of an object, and now I'm ready to add it to the array. So I'll call data.put, and I'll pass in the tour object. So that's all you need to do to create an object and add it to the array. I'll duplicate those lines of code a couple of times, and for the second and third versions, I'll change the tour and price. For the second tour, the tour property will be Death Valley, and the price will be $600. And for the third one, the tour name will be San Francisco, and the price will be $1,200. Notice that I'm not including a comma here. This is a pure numeric literal. And because we're working in Java 6 compatibility, you can't add an underscore as you might in Java 7. That won't be recognized correctly. Just leave it as is without the underscore or any other notation, and it'll be correctly data typed as a number. So now my JSON array is ready to use, and I'll come down here where I'm setting a string variable called text, and I'll get its value by calling the data objects to string method. And that serializes the value to a string, and the string can then be saved to disk. I'm going to change the name of my file, and instead of myfile.txt, I'll name this file tours, and I won't use any file extension. And finally, instead of just telling the user that the file was written to disk, I'll actually display the content that was created. After file written to disk, I'll add a line feed with a \n, and then I'll append to that data.toString. Again, I'm serializing a JSON string. I'll save my changes and run the application in the emulator. When the application opens, I'll click Create File, and I see the message that the file was written to disk, and I see the JSON notation. The square brackets wrapping the entire string mean that it's an array, and each JSON object is notated with curly braces. The string values have quotes, and the numerics don't. And it's pretty easy to read, and it's been written to disk and is ready to use. I'll add code to retrieve and read the file from disk. I'll go back to Eclipse, and I'll move down to the method readFile. First, I'll change the name of the file that I'm reading. Once again, instead of myfile.txt, I'll use tours. Then, I'll move the cursor down to after the content has been read. I'm going to move a couple of lines of code around. Before I start processing the JSON content, I want to make sure that I've closed my streams. So I'll move the calls to the close methods up a bit, and then I'll place the cursor after the close methods and before the call to display text. In order to deserialize from a string to a JSON array, declare the JSON array object, and once again I'll call it data, and I'll once again use the JSON array constructor method, but this time I'll pass in the string that contains the JSON notated content. I'll pass in b, the string buffer.toString. And now I've deserialized the content, and I'm ready to deal with it as a Java object. Just as I did with the createFile method, I'll do a quick fix and add JSON exception to my throws clause. I'll move down to after I've deserialized the data, and I'll loop through the array. I'll use a for loop, iterating over an array. My temporary variable will be I, and I'll change the array that I'm reading to data. Within the for loop, I'll create a string, and I'll name it tour, and I'll call the JSON array class's getJSONObject method, and I'll pass in the current index that I'm looping on. So now I'm returning a JSON object, and I want to retrieve just the string value representing the tour name. So from the JSON object, I'll call the getString method. Notice that there are methods for getString, getBoolean, double, int, and long. These are the data types that are supported by JSON notation. I'll call getString, and I'll pass in the key tour. Remember, that's the key that I used when I created the JSON notation. I still have one error in the for loop, and that's because the code template I used when I created my for loop treated length as a property of the data object, but in the JSON array, it's a method. So I'll move my cursor after the length property and press Control Space, and that correctly fills in the method call. So now I'm retrieving a string for each tour in the array. I'd like to concatenate them all together into a single string. I'll place the cursor above the for loop, and I'll create a new string buffer object, which I'll call toursBuffer, and I'll instantiate it with the constructor method. Then I'll move the cursor back to within the for loop, and I'll take that tour string and I'll append it. I'll call toursBuffer.append, and I'll pass in tour plus a line feed. And finally, I'll wrap up the coding by going down to the call to display text, and instead of outputting the raw buffer, now I'll output the tours buffer. So let's again review the code. I'm starting by using streams to read the content into memory. Then I'm deserializing from the string into a JSON array object. Then I'm looping through the JSON array and getting the data from the objects one at a time. And finally, I'm outputting the content that I've retrieved to the screen. I'll save and run the application in the emulator again. And remember, I've already created the file in persistent storage. I don't need to create it again. I'll click Read File, and there's the result. I've retrieved the data, and I'm displaying it on the screen. So that's a look at how you can both create files and read files using the JSON format. The JSON format is one of the smallest, most concise formats that you can use. It's incredibly fast on an Android device, and all the tools you need to use are included in the Android SDK.